Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second seminar in the 2015 Brown Bag Lunch Series, which is sponsored by the College of Education here at Albany State University. We are so very happy to have with us Dr. Tiffany Pogue, who is Assistant Professor in the College of Education. Her research interests include participatory literacy communities and the role of spirituality in communities. Today she will be speaking to us about literacy traditions, and her session is entitled Finding the Hidden and the Unhidden, African Diaspora Literacy Traditions. Dr. Tiffany Pogue.
Thank you, Dr. DeQueer. For my students, we've talked about code switching and how we can switch between standardized American English and African American Vernacular English. Those of us in ed research tend to code switch as well. So we have a teaching voice and we have a scholarly voice. So you all are familiar with my teaching voice. This morning is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to present to you as if we were at a conference. So it's going to sound different than you're accustomed to hearing me. I just want you to know I'm not putting on airs. I'm just showing you what code switching would look like in a professional setting, okay? By some estimates, roughly 10 million Africans were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands to become chattel property in the New World from the 15th through the 19th centuries. Plagued by death, disease, and acts of terrorism, enslaved Africans shielded their most powerful and personal possessions, their gods, against the onslaught of forced cultural amnesia and forgetfulness, whether through folk tales and stories, or through song and ritual. These people embarked on a journey to rewrite themselves and their stories into history. As a result of their tenacious efforts and stubborn persistence, evidence of African cultural tradition and practice in the United States is still evident. But how were these people able to transmit their traditions to subsequent generations despite political and physical oppression? What educative processes were employed to transmit their knowledge to younger people? How have differences between and among their descendants in the New World been overcome in the maintenance and practices of these spiritual communities? Unfortunately, the answers to these questions remain widely unknown. For example, in a building constructed by enslaved people at night, there are testaments of the builders' multiple literacies and spiritual identities. First African Baptist Church on Franklin Square in Savannah, Georgia, built in the 19th century by enslaved labor, conceals hidden messages in unhidden places. But what were these 19th century black folk attempting to communicate to us, their descendants, by inscribing messages within the ceiling, the floor, and the pews of the church? For now, and because we weren't looking for the answers in the right places, we do not know. Where were the lessons lost? Who was responsible for teaching them? For now, this also remains unknown. Nonetheless, anthropologists, historians, and religious studies scholars have examined diasporic African spiritual traditions, what I'm calling DASTs, for what they can tell us about the cosmologies of black people, the botanical prowess of priests and other ritual specialists, and how ethnic groups made and protected cross-cultural bonds that generated a new black identity in the West. The ability of DAS devotees and ritual specialists to transfer their knowledge and skills to others ensured that their knowledge lasted for generations. But again, where is the story of their pedagogical efforts in educational literature? So far, it is seemingly missing. In response, I have undertaken a research agenda that explores the existing relationships between literacy and African descendants in the United States in order to examine the ways in which black people have worked with literacy to reclaim, restore, and recreate not only the spiritual traditions of their ancestors, but also the communities, also while transmitting their knowledge to subsequent generations. Specifically, through my research trajectory, I strive to expand existing notions of literacy and to center the spiritual practices that make use of them. Through multiple completed and future studies, I engage such questions as, in what ways has literacy been used in the practice of black spirituality? How do practitioners of these spiritual traditions in the U.S. define and understand literacy within the context of their communities and traditions? And third, in what ways might DAST communities, these spiritual communities, constitute what has been called African Diaspora Participatory Literacy Communities. It is this third research question that serves as a guiding conceptual framework for my research. African Diaspora Participatory Literacy Communities, or ADPLCs, as defined by WIN, are communities involved in literacy events outside of traditional school and work settings. These communities combine a variety of literacy traditions, including the oral, and the written. They're based upon flexibility, responsibility, and intergenerational connections. As research interest in out-of-school literacy settings continues to increase, ADPLCs provide unique opportunities to explore the literacy and pedagogical traditions used to foster relationships among African descendants in ways that provide guidance for younger community members in the development of their own literacy skills. In addition to this conceptual framework, my research is also informed by twinned theoretical frameworks, the ethnography of communication and new literacy studies. The twinning of these two distinct theories has allowed me to tease out those components of each that lend themselves most appropriately to my research agenda. Parts of the ethnography of communication theory, namely its privileging of both the verbal and the nonverbal, as well as its privileging of community as a setting, allow me to examine the unwritten texts that reveal themselves during my investigations. Concurrently, new literacy studies enables me to also consider and understand the macro systems that contextualize the communities themselves. Taken together, the ethnography of communication and literacy studies have allowed me to see what is often unseen and to do so with a nuanced understanding of the ways the communities themselves define and practice literacy within the context of their spiritual traditions. To respond to my research questions as guided by these frameworks, I've employed a number of qualitative research methods, including, not limited to, semi-structured interviews, general historical methods, including material culture, self-ethnography, and instrument-based fieldwork. I have examined settings that include rituals and ceremonies, spaces dedicated to learning, and community centers and members' homes. My data set include archival holdings, field notes, interview transcripts, photographic documentation, and more. Now, it's important for me to approach my work from a phenomenological perspective. That is, I seek to understand a particular phenomenon, in this case literacy, from the perspective of the people involved in these communities. So I'm not enforcing my own definition of literacy. I'm looking to uncover what they define as literacy. It's also important for me to discuss positionality. I consider my personal relationships with several different kinds of Black spiritual communities of practice to be a particular strength in regards to my research agenda. First, I'm the granddaughter of a conjure man who was also a palero. I am the daughter of a Baptist minister. I consider myself Baptist, but I also hold introductory initiations into the Lukumi tradition. My intimate relationships with these communities have permitted me some degree of insider access that might not otherwise have been granted to researchers. I also believe that my non-professional relationships with members of these communities have helped me maintain a stance of responsibility and respectability in the communities I explore. Through the generous contributions of time and information provided by my study participants, I'm pleased to offer you a summary of my research findings. Now, many African cosmologies share the fundamental idea of complementary opposites. These polarities are binary partnerships that allow each construct to be known more fully. For example, there can be no concept of cold without the complementary concept of hot. The understanding and interpretation of each construct is completely necessitated by an understanding of the other. Seemingly contradictory concepts, in fact, are balanced within their most desirable states. In the West, we tend to privilege an either-or understanding of reality. However, there are still communities of practice, including these DAS communities, that appreciate a both-and ideology. In the case of African functional literacies, this is no different. In my conversations with various community members, I have found that both orality and other forms of literacy are essential to their spiritual practice. Whether through the reading of colors, patterns, energy, shells, sacred texts, or body movements, devotees are able to negotiate both spiritual and physical realms in order to understand and to manipulate their environments. Consider what Dr. Yaba Blay told me about the way she recognizes the different kinds of DAS communities in her area. This is her quote. There are people whose E-days, E-day is a bracelet, a beaded bracelet. There are people whose E-days are yellow and green, and you know that means that their babalao is Cuban or Spanish speaking. In New York, they use the language of Spanish, so he can be Cuban, he can be Puerto Rican, he can be Dominican, but he's Spanish speaking. And then you have those people whose E-days are green and purple or green and brown, which means that their babalao is African, and I think that means that they were trained in Nigeria. So just even knowing that, I see them differently, end quote. Dr. Blade's description of this kind of unwritten literacy is what I expected to encounter during my research of these classified as oral spiritual traditions. And I did find many testaments and different kinds of literacy that are in fact unwritten in that way. But my assumptions were challenged as I found an equally rich body of textual artifacts used within DAST communities. Prayer books, books on dreams and lottery numbers, handwritten prescriptions, and various divination instruction manuals were all encountered during my study. When asked explicitly about their use of literacy in the practice of spirituality, most of my participants said that it seldom played a role in what they did. However, when I asked them directly with specific questions about whether or not they wrote down divination notes, whether or not they kept notebooks, and how they used the written word, their story changed. They all found connections to DAS's written practice. One of the most interesting ways that the written text is used both in the contemporary record and in the historical record is through the use of names. The data indicate that names are used in two primary ways. First, they're used for energy manipulation, and second, they're used to record information historically. As tools of energy manipulation, names evidence the kind of necessary balance required of the oral and the written in many DAS communities. Names spoken have the ability to call forth a person's energy. One priest told me, if you don't like somebody, write their name down, stick it in the freezer, and freeze them. Speaking the name brings forth energy, but writing the name keeps it where the ritual specialist wants it to be. Frozen, sweetened, soured, tied up, and or destroyed. Names themselves are also important in preserving the history of DAS. One of the ways this is done that I encountered in the field is through the Moyuba. The Moyuba is a prayer that is spoken to open any Lukumi spiritual practice, any ceremony or ritual. The Moyuba is repeated before the ceremony begins. And in the Moyuba, which changes from house to house, but all the fundamental elements are listed there, the person first prays that cool energy covers the road, covers the house, and covers the deity responsible for carrying that prayer to the feet of God. And then they offer respect to God, the creator, Olodumare, as they say in Lukumi. And then they begin with Ibaye Bayantunu, and they list each one of their ancestors by name. Once they do that, they enter the Kinkamashe, which they offer to every living priest in their lineage. And then they go to Ibaye Bayantunu again for the deceased priests in their lineages. And then the prayer really begins after all these people are listed. So in this oral way, history is encoded within every ritual ceremony. If you want to know who someone's spiritual family is, all you have to do is listen to their prayer. And because the deceased priests are also listed, you also know the history of their spiritual lineage. While these oral constructs like the Moyuba are indeed evidence that these traditions are oral in nature, it is not unusual for young devotees and children to write down the Moyuba before they learn it through memorization. The situations in which the language and other communicative devices are employed transmit a specific message not only to those for whom, but only to those for whom the information is deemed appropriate. Elders are responsible for regulating the necessary contextual information needed to decode rituals. One priest told me, you don't feed a baby steak if all it can eat is pablum, pablum being a kind of formula. The job of the elder then is to evaluate the readiness of devotees to move forward in their learning. Once these decisions are made, the strategies employed by elders to transmit DAST occult information to novice devotees includes direct instruction, and there's an evidence of that in the data, apprenticeship and modeling, and spiritual methods. In many cases, elders employ a combination of these strategies. According to the communities I explored, no person can function alone. They must be part of a set. They must be part of a community. in which the members are directly responsible for one another. Perhaps it is this point that allows for diversity and inclusivity to be embraced by the spiritual community itself. And it's also what links them most closely to ADPLCs. Similar to other communities of practice, ADPLCs are collaborative learning relationships. Within them, individuals share a particular passion and interact regularly. In this case, it's spirituality. The flexibility of literacy practice in ADPLCs is inclusive. No one in these communities is denied involvement simply because they may not be black, or they may be Spanish speaking, they may be Yoruba speaking. No one is ever denied access. In fact, one priest told me that while some rituals, of course, are closed to outsiders, when it comes to drummings, no one can be excluded lest you turn away the deities themselves. The importance of community standing was stressed by all the participants I interviewed and is also evidenced in the historical record. I was told that energy is generated from the community members working with one another so that they can utilize that same energy to move forward, to accomplish things, to be successful, and to be happy with the results they achieve. And this is why, as one priest told me, although there are now more books available on these spiritual traditions, the traditions themselves cannot last without oral and human instruction. And this is her quote: "You can sit down and there are books that will tell you from beginning to end what the ceremony is, but you still won't be able to do it. One, because you need a community of people that know how to do it. And two, because it's not possible to understand the ceremony without the energy, and the community is responsible for that." The condition of schooling in this country necessitates a paradigmatic shift from resignation to the courage to explore the margins for all that will be necessary to save our children. I could cite all of the bleak statistics facing American public school students, especially those belonging to black and brown populations, that we're so accustomed to hearing in the field of education. Or I could offer a critique of the weak educational policies that have created the educational crisis among students of color. And this is certainly important work to be done by others. However, I refuse to do so at the present. Instead, I suggest that while the situation is indeed critical and deserving of focused attention, the emphasis should not only be on the problem, but on an understanding that the environment of public education is no more harsh nor oppressive than has been faced by communities before, especially communities of color. Black children are part of a historical meta-narrative in which their people have always found the need and the strength to respond to hostile environments while protecting their own cultural norms, ideas, and communities. I'm convinced that by engaging in a research trajectory that explores the strategies and philosophies employed by them to do so, we can gain an understanding that will allow us to confront whatever failures our public school system is creating. Specifically, I believe that we must continue to expand our notions of literacy to align with the social and cultural practices of all groups, including marginalized populations, so that the fullness of their traditions can be explored and used by public school teachers. If indeed the educational crisis is as bleak as they tell us it is, we must be willing to look in all places for the answers that address them. Thank you. We'll pass forward.
And we have some time for a question and answer period. So if you have any questions that are related to the research that Dr. Pogue has outlined for us today, we can discuss them in a participatory format to keep in line with her theme.
And like you're talking about education, I know you're talking about education, but what exactly about it? Like I know you're talking about the local me.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at out-of-school educational practices. So we talk about schooling and education as if they're always synonymous, and they're not. Education often happens, and I would say most often happens outside of the schoolhouse. And unfortunately, in educational research, we tend to pay more attention to what happens in the schoolhouse than outside. And so my argument is, if these people have sustained themselves for hundreds of years under physical, economic, and I would say spiritual assaults, then their educational strategies must be worth something. And we need to be looking at them to figure out what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Are you thinking that like they should be incorporated within the schools?
Yes.
They go to?
Yes. For example, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development is a very famous psychological theory in the field of educational psych. And when you look at it, it makes sense. Vygotsky is arguing that you need to look at a student in comparison to a particular cohort, see how they're affected by their contexts, the material and social aspects of their environment, to see what they're ready to do with guided assistance, what they can do alone, what they're ready to learn, etc. But what I found by looking in the field at these communities is not only were the elders doing that without the name, the zone of proximal development, they were also including spirituality as a necessary component of what has to be considered before a child or a person is moved forward in their education. So this is an example of how you can take Western educational theory, look in these out-of-school contexts, and find more information that helps complicate how we use the zone of proximal development.
I actually came in a few minutes late too, but was your study abroad, was it more like a religious base?
Now this wasn't abroad, because a lot of the existing research on Lukumi, for example, in the Yoruba tradition, happened in Cuba or Nigeria or Brazil. I'm beginning to move the study more to the United States, so the communities I explored were in Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Philadelphia, New York, and DC.
So from all the places that you researched in, would you say that your research was pretty much on the same path as, like, say, from New York to Louisiana? DC?
There are subtle differences between. One of the things I thought going to these different places would give me different perspectives, but what I began to uncover is that the communities are connected to one another. So I would be interviewing someone in Philadelphia and she would be referencing someone I interviewed in Atlanta. So the communities are connected. I also looked at the historical record. So I did some research with Zora Neale Hurston's work with Southern Hoodoo, and she was doing that research in the 20s and the 30s. The historical record also aligns with what the contemporary practitioners were telling me.
So, like, the people that you interviewed, they were of the Lukumi?
No, not only Lukumi. So other traditions, I interviewed some conjure people who just work roots. So they don't necessarily have a title for what they do. I interviewed Lukumi people, both those who come through Spanish-speaking houses and those who come through Nigerian houses who usually don't use the term Lukumi. They call themselves Yoruba. I also worked with some Akan people, which is a spiritual tradition based on the Akan people of Ghana, and some Paleros, which would be coming through West Central Africa, the Congo, through Cuba into the U.S.
Were these individuals of the older generation, or was it mixed?
My participants that were interviewed, they were older and my age. But many of the ones who are in their 40s are raising children in the same traditions that they're in. So they were also talking about how they were taught and how they teach. Good question.
Did you find similarities between Christianity and the groups that you studied in terms of spirituality? Was there some overlap?
There was a lot of overlap. One of I just hinted at it in the beginning just for time, but my first study actually was on First African Baptist Church in Savannah. So it's a Baptist church. It's arguably the oldest Baptist church in the United States. It actually started on Silver Bluff Plantation in South Carolina before the Revolutionary War, and then moved with the British into Savannah. And, well, you may not know, but this is evidence of African spiritual literacies embedded within the church. In the bottom, that's a Congolese cosmogram. Paleros use these kinds of markings in their prayers, rituals, and ceremonies. So even the churches that I'm studying have evidence of these spiritual traditions embedded within them. If you look at the slave narratives, which was part of this initial research, when people converted to Christianity, they were very clear that what they were converting to was not the Christianity of the white folk. It was their own brand of Christianity, which had been adapted to fit their most traditional practices. So there was a lot of flexibility between the two. And then I interviewed a lot of people like myself who consider ourselves Christian, but also who practice these African spiritual traditions. We don't see a conflict, although the conflict is seen by Christians who don't practice DASTs. Our sacred text tells us to embrace everybody where they are, and we are anti-proselytization, meaning we're not trying to convert anybody. And that's where the difference usually comes up.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
Were most of your participants U.S. American?
was a variety?
It was a variety. It was a variety. There was one first generation Ghanaian. There were more than a few Cuban Americans. There was a Nigerian American, and everybody else has been African American. But the communities, now those are the participants who I interviewed. When I go into the field, then there are all sorts of people in the field. So when I'm going to these ceremonies, especially these drummings that are open to anyone, there are ethnicities and nationalities from all over represented.
What made you want to study this?
Okay, this is where the positionality piece gets important in the larger work. Because as I said earlier, I do have introductory initiations into Lukumi. I'm Lukumi. And then I have a grandfather who was a conjure man. And so I can stand up here and fake to you like the literature led me to this study, but really it came to me in a dream. In a dream, I was told to look at the buildings and look at what I see on the buildings. And I'm from Mobile, and that same Christmas when I was driving down the road, I took that picture. I recognized the shape to be Sankofa, which is an Adinkra symbol from Ghana. And it started me wondering, well, if people brought their symbols with them, how come we never learned about how they were reading and writing before they got here? And what happened to the messages they left? There's a reason Sankofa exists in Mobile. Mobile is the site of the last slave ship that came into the United States. Sankofa means don't ever forget the past. And the Akan people saw ironsmithing as a sacred tradition. So the fact that these things are there are beyond coincidence to me. To me, that was a message that, hey, look, we left you messages. You got to learn how to read them. And unfortunately, I can't interview those people, so I'm trying to back into history and see what traditions were passed down along with these spiritual traditions.
Thank you, Dr. Pogue. I believe that we've all learned quite a bit today. And I think what was really interesting was to look at the footprints, these artifacts that are left behind in plain sight, yet we don't understand the connection or don't understand the messages that they were trying to give to us and that they still exist today. So it's very interesting, especially when we study slavery, when we read slave narratives, we tend to get the idea that when slaves converted to Christianity, they left a lot of their African traditions behind. So I'm happy to hear that many of those African traditions were in fact embedded in ways that may not have been as visible, and that could have been a way of preserving it from others when they were on the plantation. So I think it's a lot to think. Okay.
The very first time I went to an African ritual, I was scared to death, because if you watch Hollywood, you think it's witchcraft, bloodshed, you know, goats and naked women and all that to be scared of. And matter of fact, there was a man coming out of the basement. He was barefoot and it was blood spattered on his feet. And I was like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? So I start praying, because I'm like, oh, what I'm in this room, what am I gonna do? And the ceremony started. And I instantly relaxed, because it was just like devotion in the church I grew up in. The women were on one side of the circle, the men were on the other side. The person who was about to pray walked around and shook everybody's hand while there's a call and response spiritual being sung. And I'm like, this is church. So you're exactly right. What we do now is part of what they were doing then, and somehow we have forgotten. And I'm trying to go back and uncover why we do what we do.